In this series, I've been talking about the Second World War and looking at different countries that aren't normally associated with having a large role in that conflict. And in today's video, I'd like to talk about India. Now, I can already hear the keyboard warriors clacking because yes, it's true that at that point in the Second World War, India as an independent nation did not exist, and instead it was British India, sometimes informally called the British Raj, as what is today India was ruled over by the British Crown. And it's not just India either, because this entity of the British Raj spread over what is today India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. But obviously that would be a very long title, so this is India during the Second World War. While several European powers had reached India before them, the English arrived in 1611 with their first colony. By 1757, with their victory over the Nawab of Bengal and their French allies at the Battle of Plassey, they started to reach out and control more of the land in the Indian subcontinent. By 1818, the British East India Company had expelled practically all the other European powers from the subcontinent, and there were no native rulers that were powerful enough to seriously question who was in charge. In 1857, some 40 years later, the Sepoy Mutiny broke out when Indian soldiers rebelled against the British. And after this was successfully put down, control of India was removed from the East India Company and transferred instead to the British Crown. While most of the subcontinent was controlled by the British Crown, large parts were also being controlled by semi-independent princedoms who were subject to the British, who were called the princely states and had varying degrees of autonomy. In 1885, however, there was the creation of a new political party called the INC, or the Indian National Congress, which initially sought to bring more native Indians into the ruling of the Indian subcontinent, and would, after several decades, become the main vehicle driving for Indian self-determination and independence. In 1914, Indian soldiers and the Indian economy were vital to the British during the First World War. Indian soldiers and also non-combatants served on the Western Front in the fields of Flanders and France, as well as during the Gallipoli campaign and throughout Mesopotamia, leading to an eventual British victory there. Some 800,000 Indian soldiers served, with a further 200,000 non-combatants also spending time. Around 75,000 of these would be killed during the 4 years. The INC following the Second World War became increasingly associated with a very famous figure today, Mahatma Gandhi. And it was during this time in 1929 that the group pushed for full independence and started political agitation against British rule in order to achieve this aim. 10 years later, of course, in 1939, Britain would be pulled into the Second World War in Europe. And it was taken for granted that British India would be supporting Britain and the wider empire in its struggle against the Germans and her allies across the globe. Of course, the INC was somewhat divided over what to do. Some advocated for purely helping the British in order to then ask for independence once the war was done, while others, such as Gandhi, were not in favour of helping the British, as they claimed that India should first have full independence before joining the British side in the war against the Germans, something that the British rejected. Nevertheless, many men and some women still joined the BIA, or the British Indian Army. This was, of course, the British Army made up of mainly Indian troops stationed in India. And in 1919, after the First World War, they also served in various other conflicts, such as fighting in the Third Anglo-Afghan War against the Afghans, as well as between 1936 and 1939 putting down various tribal rebellions in North Waziristan, today in Pakistan. The British initially were not expecting that they would require Indian troops and Indian help during the war, but as France, the Low Countries and Scandinavia all fell to the advancing Germans, they started to realise that they did in fact need the vast supplies of manpower that the Indian subcontinent could supply, and many millions of Indians stepped forward to be enlisted into the BIA, as well as into its fledgling air service and the British Indian Navy. This rose from around 205,000 men in 1939 to 2.5 million men at the war's end. Indian troops served on many of the major battlefields in which the British were involved, such as in East Africa fighting against the Italians in Somaliland, and also in the more famous North African campaign, fighting first against the Italians and later against the Germans, being led by Erwin Rommel, and with the Afrika Korps. The Indian troops provided excellent anti-tank services, especially at the Battle of El Hakeim, and were a crucial part of the Commonwealth force that eventually pushed the Axis out of the African continent. Indian troops also served to the east of India, particularly in the British colonies and enclaves in Southeast Asia, such as Hong Kong, as well as in Singapore. After the fall of these two to the Japanese, around 55,000 Indian soldiers were taken prisoner by the Japanese, many of whom would be put into prisoner of war camps and treated terribly. Many of them would die in captivity. The BIA also served as the majority of the Commonwealth force inside Malaya when the Japanese attacked this in 1942 and 1943. And while they were initially pushed out by the Japanese and back into India, the Gurkhas were especially important in training up a new unit, the Chindits, that would fight in the Burman jungle against the Japanese advance, and the British Indian Army was the largest part of the British force that in 1944 was able to defeat the Japanese advance at the battles of Imphal and Kohima when the Japanese army attempted to invade India. Indian soldiers were then praised as being the heroes of the Stalingrad of the East, as this large battle is often called, as this was the major turning point in this campaign, following which the Japanese were retreating through mainland Southeast Asia, and the British Indian forces and other Commonwealth allies were able to drive them back all the way to Japan. British Indian soldiers also ended up serving on guard duty following the war in French Indochina, which today is Vietnam, Laos and Cambodia, and there they actually fought against the Viet Minh, who were the Vietnamese soldiers who fought against French colonial control and indeed against these caretaker troops, as they were called, of the BIA, who would later again morph into the Viet Cong and fight the Americans in the Vietnam War. In a similar way, British Indian troops were also stationed in the Dutch East Indies, waiting for Dutch troops to arrive there, and there became embroiled in fighting with Indonesian nationalists who would later start the Indonesian National Revolution, something which would eventually culminate in a full-scale war with the Netherlands and result in Indonesian independence. But of course, India was itself a colonial possession of the British, and now Indian soldiers were being sent to what they saw as repressing many of these people for another colonial power. So how did Indian people feel about fighting for people who really were their colonial overlords? Needless to say, India has come a huge way since the Second World War. For one, it attained its independence, and it's now making strides towards modernity in line with some of the most advanced countries in the world, even going into space. And if you want to find out more about that, then I would highly recommend today's video sponsor, MagellanTV, a video streaming service with thousands of different documentaries on history, space, science, and lots more for you to check out. In particular, there's one called Indian Space Dreams, which talks about the country's ambitions in space, and especially a more recent project to try and map out, with using a satellite, a black hole, something that hasn't been done before and that the Indian space program would be trying to do on a fraction of NASA's budget, while at the same time looking at some of the criticism India has received in its space program, as it still has around 84 million people living in poverty. There's even a special offer for viewers of this channel if they go to try.magellantv.com/history with Hilbert, and if you then buy a year's membership, you'll get another annual membership card completely free. So that's 2 years of great documentaries in the bag. Check it out, the link is in the description below, and you can also go over to the link on the screen. Well, as we've discussed, the INC was a particularly important political party agitating for Indian independence, and they had been somewhat divided about how to treat the Second World War, with figures like Gandhi believing that India should be given independence before sending its sons and daughters and resources to a conflict in which it had no stakes. In 1942, Gandhi gave a famous speech in which he said that India should quit the war, and this was known as the Quit India movement. Following this speech, he and around 60,000 other members of the INC were arrested, which resulted in widespread protests throughout India. Now, the INC, while it did have several members from both Sikhs and Buddhists, Jains and Muslims, was largely seen as being a predominantly Hindu movement. At the same time, there was also another movement called the All India Muslim League, which, as the name suggests, was a Muslim movement that sought for the creation of a separate Muslim nation state apart from the Indian state that was being asked for by the INC. And of course, this was the forerunner to the idea of Pakistan. And unlike the INC, they were very supportive of the British war effort against the Germans, and this is reflected in the army, as Muslims were disproportionately represented as fighting in the BIA against the enemies of Britain. While some Indians chose non-compliance with the British and others chose full support, another option was taken by Subhas Chandra Bose, who decided instead that the enemy of his enemy was his friend, and so he, being a leading member of the INC, was placed under house arrest by the British in 1940, but he managed to escape and then fled to Nazi Germany, where he was tasked by the likes of Hitler and Himmler with creating an Indian division, which he did, which was called the FIL, or the Free Indian Legion. Now, this was called Azad Hind, which is Free India in, I believe it's Hindi. He recruited from the Indian diaspora in occupied Europe, largely in Germany, who wanted to see a free India, as well as giving the option to captured Indian POWs that they could either remain prisoners of war living in terrible conditions, or they could instead fight to free their fatherland from the colonial oppressors, which many of them in the end decided to do. Now, while there were many twists and turns and many of them would eventually end up going over to Southeast Asia, some remained fighting in the German forces and were incorporated into their own division of the Waffen-SS, who served on the Atlantic seawall and fought against the Allied invasions in Normandy, as this rather famous now image shows. They only ever amounted to around 4,500 troops, so this wasn't an incredibly large unit, but it did exist at the time. What's interesting is if we compare the demographic of those who decided to join this Free Indian Legion and the BIA itself, is that the BIA was made up of several more Muslims than Hindus, with a smaller amount of Sikhs. But if one compares this to the Azad Hind, there were disproportionately more Hindus and Sikhs fighting for this unit, while Muslims tended not to join in as large numbers. And a big difference to the BIA was that regardless of religion and caste, everyone served together in the same regiment. Of course, that's not to say that this was all lovely. They were fighting for the Nazis at the end of the day, but it's interesting to see how things were different in the different armies that the Indians fought in during the Second World War. There's also a mention here that in 1942, the Italians also formed their own Indian Legion. This was formed by an Indian expat who lived in Rome. This became known as the Battaglione India Libera, or the Battaglione Azad Hindustan, which means the same thing, but then in Hindi, or in Hindustani as the language is actually called. But I should note that this was never larger than a few hundred men, and it never actually saw action in any theatres of war, as when the Indian soldiers heard that the British and their Indian allies had won at the Battle of El Alamein, they actually mutinied against the Italians, and they never saw combat in that way. In 1943, realizing that the Germans were retreating from the Eastern Front and had lost in North Africa, Bose decided instead to transfer the unit by U-boat from Germany over to Japan, and from there they joined in with the Imperial Japanese forces in their campaigns in the mainland of Southeast Asia, which at that point was going very well. He at this point formed the INA, which is the Indian National Army. This was a particularly prescient move because the Japanese had captured tens of thousands of Indian soldiers during their rapid advance against the British in Southeast Asia, and he hoped to recruit these men into their number. These prisoners of war faced the even more drastic choice of either joining the INA or being summarily executed by the Japanese, a fate that many of the Indian soldiers, to their credit, ended up choosing. Bose decided to create the Provisional Government of Free India, known simply as Azad Hind, although this was only ever given ceremonial powers by the Japanese, who had no real interest in reviving India as a free nation. One of the tragedies of the INA is that they they did in fact see combat with Japanese forces during their advance at Imphal and Kohima, where the INA were fighting against their Indian countrymen serving in the BIA, and they ended up killing one another, and many of the INA were killed during the retreat, dying of diseases as well as drowning and exhaustion as the Japanese rout was complete. Many of those who were captured by the Indians were in a strange sort of limbo. They were seen as being traitors by the British Indian soldiers, who were of course fighting for the other side, a view upheld by the British, while at home in India some saw them as heroes and freedom fighters seeking to liberate their country. At the same time, after the war, it was found out that several war crimes were indeed committed by the INA when serving alongside the Japanese, although how much culpability and fault there was with the INA, or whether they were simply following Japanese High Command's orders to do the same, is quite unclear. Nonetheless, it's a very interesting story about Indians serving on the Axis side as well as on the Allied side during the Second World War. Now, India was actually invaded during the Second World War, and it was in 1914 that Japanese troops landed on the Andaman Islands, which sit rather a far way across the east of the Indian Ocean from India itself. And there is actually also an island there where there is still an uncontacted tribe, something about which I made a video that has gone, I think you could call it viral in the meantime. So if you haven't seen that, feel free to check it out. Another part of India was also invaded, but not in the way that you might think in terms of the Second World War. And this was in 1944 when Afghan tribesmen flooded across the Afghanistan border, across the mountains, and invaded a part of what at that point was the very northwest of India. These Afghan tribesmen had risen in revolt against the king of Afghanistan at the time, but they were eventually driven back by the fledgling British Indian Air Service. These invasions therefore were no serious threat to India and her people. However, a far worse enemy would indeed strike the heart of India during the war. It occurred in the province of Bengal, one of the most populous regions of India, where the majority of people were semi-starving on a regular basis due to the fact that there simply wasn't enough food to go round at the best of times. The population was around 60 million in 1940, and following the Japanese advances in 1942 through Burma, an area that exported lots of rice that helped the population of Bengal to remain fed, when these shipments no longer came through, a humanitarian crisis started to loom. This only worsened when many refugees escaping from Japanese brutality made a home for themselves in Bengal, thus adding more hungry mouths to feed, at least another 500,000. Japanese Navy was also responsible for sinking around 100,000 tons of shipping, much of it food, that was also headed for Bengal itself. This, combined with several natural disasters, a cyclone which caused tidal waves and flooding throughout much of the province, as well as the fact that large areas of arable land that otherwise could have produced lots of food for the population were being used as airstrips for Allied bombers, especially Americans doing bombing runs into China in support of Chinese forces, meant that there was even less land available for food for the local population, and a famine broke out. While the exact importance of each factor is hotly contested between historians, certainly a large contributing factor, if not one of the main instigating factors, was the fact that large amounts of grain and shipments were being shipped abroad to feed British and indeed British Indian soldiers fighting in the war. Trade barriers between different regions of India had also been put in place, meaning that domestic sources of food supply were also not forthcoming. Traditionally, food had been one of the main currencies in the area for labourers, but after much of the land had been appropriated by the military, the labourers were compensated in kind by being paid in cash. But when prices rose due to wartime inflation, the cash was not enough to buy the food sources that they so desperately needed, and which was in ever decreasing supply. And this has also been seen as a kind of tampering in order to create hyperinflation, so that much of the food was sold at much higher prices on the black market, but most of the people couldn't afford it and in the end starved. There was also a problem with the supply of cloth, and despite the fact that India produced some 600,000 miles of cloth, there was barely enough to go around for the people of Bengal due to the price, as the army was buying up practically all of the cloth to clothe its own soldiers. And so there was also what became known as the cloth famine in Bengal, so that many people, including many children and women, were half naked because they couldn't afford the cloth that could clothe them. The response from the British was incredibly lackluster. Even before the famine, they were being warned that it was approaching by colonial officials and others, and they simply denied the fact that anything was going wrong. And later they claimed that there was nothing they could do because of shipping, even when other countries such as Australia were offering to send food aid. They turned these down, and for this reason some have claimed that the Bengal famine should be seen as a genocide because of the inaction of British authorities to do anything about the problem, which was killing many of the people in Bengal. And this killed between 2 and 3 million people from between 1943 and 1944. Despite facing great challenges at home, some in India, especially in the princely states, did also supply humanitarian aid to those from abroad. For example, in Kolhapur state, around 5,000 refugee children from Poland who had been interned in Soviet gulag camps after the invasion of their country, after being turned away by every other country. And there is still, if you visit Kolhapur today, a Polish graveyard where around 170 of those who decided to stay after the end of the war are now buried. But that is the end of this video. I may have missed some things, and do let me know in the comments below if you have any more fun facts and information about India and Indians during the Second World War, because there is a huge amount to get through in this video, and I hope that I have covered a few of the main bases, but there remains a lot more to be said. Of course, the Second World War is very important for India because right after the Second World War, the demands for independence reached a fever pitch, and of course, very soon after that, I think in 1947, India itself becomes independent and is partitioned between India and Pakistan, which at that point had an eastern Pakistan and a western Pakistan, which later of course would develop into Pakistan proper as we know it today, and Bangladesh. But that is for another video. Let me know in the comments below, did you enjoy this one? What would you like to see in the future in this series, and any other videos that you would like to see? Let me know and I will do my best to get around to it in the future. But in the meantime, I have been Hilbert and this has been The History.